Thank you very much. It's certainly good to be here. As I mentioned in the group before, one thing I enjoy about this group is all the young people. I'm used to a sea of gray, and more a sea of white, which is fine. I mean, my wife has a white hair, but it's just, we need the young people to deal with this issue, and the issue is really important, as I will present in my PowerPoint. But let me read from one of the books out there, which they gave me a copy, which was nice of them, so I thought I should plug it. And it says here, this is an observation by a person who has a PhD in biology and a PhD in theology and a PhD in philosophy. And he said, and I quote, "Throughout the years I've observed that biologists are generally more willing to listen to and engage opposing arguments than are theologians." You got that? And I've noticed this over and over, so I was happy to see this, somebody else observing the same thing. This is because biological generalists are somewhat aware of the weaknesses in the theory of evolution, whereas theologians generally are not, because they don't study biology. And this is understandable since many theologians have not studied evolution academically. And then he goes on to state that that is a problem because so many theologians naively believe that the evidence is there and they have to accept it, and that means they often have to conform the scriptures to what they think is the evidence for evolution. And this whole book, by the way, is about, it talks about the theologians and the ideas they propose to try to harmonize theology, the Bible, with evolution. And my response, and I get that a lot, people say, well, can't we just believe in both? Can't we believe that God used evolution as a means of creation? Well, we could, except the problem is that the evidence against evolution is absolutely overwhelming. There's no evidence for it. And if you come up with evidence, you let me know and we'll do some papers and we'll both get the Nobel Prize and I'll share it with you. It's just the evidence is not there. And I'm working on a book now which I contrast humans with our supposed evolutionary ancestors, apes, chimps in particular. And there's so many contrasts, it's just enormous. The most recent one I came up with was studies of chimps and apes in general found the most verbal chimp can make 30 different sounds. 30 different sounds. How many sounds, different sounds and combinations, sound sets they call them, can you make? Hundreds of thousands. The English language alone has over 1 million words, and I bet all of you could say every one of them. You might not know what they mean, but you can say every one of them. So the difference between the sound sets that the most articulate chimp can make and you can make is just enormous. And that doesn't even begin to get into things like art. We have chimps who make a living doing art, and I think any 3-year-old could equally equal the chimp's work. And we have any artists in here, but my son's an artist, and he could easily do far better than the most articulate chimp. But this presentation here I'm focusing on because you already know the evidence against evolution is overwhelming. If you don't, then there's plenty of books out there. But a lot of people are unaware of the effect of Darwinism on society. And the effect has been really horrendous. And I'm kind of giving you snippets from different books that I've written. I've written 6 books which basically summarize this topic. And what I'm talking about is not controversial at all. If you know anything about communism or Marxism or Hitler, etc., you would be aware of this. It's well documented. Hitler didn't die that long ago. We have many historians who have very carefully chronicalized his regime and what he believed, what his disciples believed, and why they did what they did. And one thing about the Germans is they really carefully documented everything very well. And there are groups today that attempt to deny the Holocaust ever occurred. Well, the Germans have the names and address of just about everybody who died in the Holocaust. We know who they are. We know when they were born. They kept really good records. And the reason for that was because Hitler felt, as you know, that he wanted to produce a superior race. The problem is the superior race, the Aryan race, whoever they were, the Aryan race was mixing by marriage with inferior races, and that caused degeneration of the race. Okay? So that's what they were concerned about. And they felt when they achieved that, and they were confident they would, when they achieved that, they wanted the world to know what they did and how important it was and how great it was. And so they wanted to document so people later on could say, do you know why we're all superior? Because this is what Hitler did, and this is the evidence. So they documented the Holocaust enormously, as well as the other aspects around that. And as a result, they thought, prove to the world that what they were doing was good. By the way, the idea of inferior races was the scientific consensus. There was hardly any disagreement among what they were doing. And that's one thing that Hitler looked at. Well, one of the quotes I have will show that, so I'll just scroll down to that. And this is, my one book is out here, Hitler and the Nazi Darwinian Worldview. And some of what I have here came from that book. And this is the other book, The Darwin Effect, which documents more carefully, especially the Darwinian ideas that women were inferior and the ideas of Darwin that gave birth to communism and Marxism. So women might find that chapter why Darwin felt women were inferior interesting. But that's another talk. Okay, Nazism. The Greater German Empire was to be a racially pure empire. Germany was the last best racial hope of mankind. And this was said by Thomas Childers, who's a professor of history, who was trying to explain why they did what they did. What they did, they were not trying to do anything bad as we see it today. They were trying to do something, well, like when you need surgery to remove a tumor, it's difficult. The doctor has to open your body up, pull the tumor out, sew you up, but in the end, it's better, much better, because now you have the cancer, the tumor removed. So what they believed was, when this is all said and done, when we have a superior race in the world and all you inferior races are destroyed, this will give us greatness and accolades. And, well, Germany was the last best racial hope of mankind. And they really believed this. Today we see this as ludicrous. But, of course, as Christians, we believe what? All people are descendants of Adam and Eve. We're all brothers and sisters. Therefore, as the Bible says, one blood. There is no superior race. And Viktor Frankl, he summarized what I have researched and found, and he said, and he was a scientist that taught at University in Vienna, but he said, now listen to this carefully as I read it. This really summarizes my book. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. This word means in the German heredity, basically. Blood refers to your heredity, and soil is the environment. So the Nazis are a product of, and they wanted to utilize blood and soil to produce a superior race. He goes on and says, I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of the nihilistic scientists and philosophers. And I have a whole chapter in a book coming out shortly, I hope, that the cause of the Holocaust was the scientists and the philosophers. Mainly the scientists. In fact, the Council of Wannsee, where they formulated the final solution, I think 9 out of the 15 or 16 that were there had academic doctorates. U.S. Holocaust Memorial Book, Deadly Medicine, Creating the Master Race. They did, by the way, an excellent job in this book, done by the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And this compilation was based on the exhibition that they presented in Washington as well as otherwise, and included essays by internationally recognized authorities on Nazism, which document that the scientific establishment was crucial in planning and carrying out the Holocaust. So we often like to blame Hitler, and certainly he has his share of blame, but the cause of the Holocaust was, well, Hitler was somewhat of a figurehead. I know the buck stops here and so on, and he could have done a lot to stop it, but basically the Holocaust was, well, as the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and they know what they're talking about, they really do, was carried out by the scientific establishment. And this is in a book that they published. Excellent book, full of pictures, and I was really surprised that they put it out. And that's the book, the cover of it. It's a coffee table-sized book, and they provide compelling documentation of the Darwinian eugenic origins of the Holocaust. And there, Mr. Hitler, you can see what he looked like. By the way, why did he wear that funny mustache? Anybody know? It said the ideal, I'll show you pictures later on, the ideal Aryan was blonde, blue-haired, and didn't have a Jewish nose, whatever that is. And Hitler had wasn't blue-eyed, didn't have blonde hair, and by the way, he had a, quote, Jewish nose. Now the Jewish nose, they call it a Roman nose. The Roman nose actually resulted from interbreeding with Germans. Semitic people don't have a Roman nose. Jews don't have a Roman nose historically, but they do today because they intermix so much with the Germans. And that was a problem, of course, when they were trying to carry out the Holocaust, because there was hardly anybody who was, quote, pure-blooded Jew. So that was a problem. The Nazi goal: expunge the Judeo-Christian Muslim doctrine of human divine origins, and you can see why that's important, from the mainline German theology and its schools. Replace it with Darwinism, and that replacement contributed to the acceptance of social Darwinism that culminated in the Holocaust, and this is a quote from a leading authority in this area. In other words, they took over the schools, and they taught in the schools Darwinism, and this is specifically what they looked at. Origin of Species, this was published by Charles Darwin in 1859, the first edition. This is a later edition. Or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So some people say they perverted Darwinism to do what they did. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's the subtitle. That's pretty clear. Pretty clear what he wanted to do. Preservation of favored races. That's a nicer way of saying it, but basically, well, the preservation of favored races. The Aryan race, of course, is what the Germans thought. And this is my book on Charles Darwin, which documents this in more detail. They didn't have that here, but you can get it online if you would like to. That's one of the most successful books that I've published, by the way. Darwin's major goal in developing his theory was religious. I mentioned this before in my other presentation. In his words, he wanted to murder God. So many people believe that he was a scientist and trying to find the scientific answer to the origin of life. No, he was trying to find science to defend his religion, which was to murder God and replace that with natural selection, is what he was trying to do. And Goebbels wrote in his diary in 1939, the Führer is deeply anti-Christian. He regards Christianity as a symptom of decay, and rightly so, Goebbels said. Now, why would this be the case? Well, what does Christianity teach? The opposite of what Hitler was trying to do. All races are equal, they're all children of God, and the scriptures do not separate those of one group from another group. All people, regardless of sex, race, etc., I didn't use the word race, of course, but are equal before God. And one thing they had to do was not only eliminate the weaker races, but to increase the stronger race. And to do that, they gave this medal here to the Deutsche Mutter. So if you had, I think, 6 kids, you got this medal. If you had 9 kids, you got a bigger one. And if you got 12 kids, you had, 10 of them or something. But these were gold medals, and they encouraged the women to have big families. And few resisted. You can see the support for Hitler was pretty strong. And again, this audience is made up of attorneys, professors, doctors, and professional people. This is Parliament. There was an exception, Bonhoeffer, one of the most famous exceptions. He had a hard time with their opposition to Christianity, of course, but he also had a hard time with the racism. He came to the United States to visit our churches, and he went to several black churches in New York, in Harlem, and he really was enthralled at what he experienced in those churches. These people were really into worship. And I just last week spoke in a black church, several, and they are. Many of the black churches, they don't sit and listen to the sermon. They participate in the sermon. And you have to get used to that. I would say something like, there's a problem with evolution. Amen, brother, amen. Preach the word. And I knew they weren't listening. And so it was very, you kind of have to get used to that because I had to pause a lot. But on the other hand, I knew they were listening. I knew they were part of what I was going on. And the singing, by the way, is incredible. And I guess the best singing I've ever heard in my life was when I was invited to go to South Africa. And the church there was a tent with a trailer. And the tent, the floor was ground, was dirt. And there was this young girl, I don't know, she was maybe 15 or, I couldn't tell, but just kind of stood out, black, kind of stood out among all the people. And I kind of noticed her and thought she's really be a sweet girl. It'd be nice to have a girl like that for my daughter. And then later on, they started singing, and this girl led the singing. And I have honestly never in my entire life heard such incredible a cappella singing as I did from those kids. Really, really good. And that's the same impression Bonhoeffer evidently had. Some of the churches didn't have an organ. They didn't have the accompaniment, so they had to sing a cappella, and Bonhoeffer was enthralled at what he saw. And the main opposition to Nazism was the churches and Christians. Many Christians were among the righteous Gentiles, which is what the Jews call them. And Corrie ten Boom, of course, is the most famous example. And here's a wall of all the righteous Gentiles, those who stood up. Now, the church did not do nearly as much as soon as they should have, but of all the people that did anything to oppose the Holocaust and help the Jews, it was mostly Christians. But again, they didn't do enough, not nearly enough. They did far too little, too late. And Hitler wanted to control the schools. We're concerned about this in the States. I guess there's less concern in Canada, but we're concerned about the schools because by law they have to teach Darwinism as fact in the schools in the United States. If you express doubts about Darwin, you could lose your job or at least get a warning and say, you are not to question the fact of evolution. That is to be taught as fact that is not questionable. But shouldn't you question everything in science? Well, everything but Darwinism. That is the area you are not to question, because questioning Darwinism is backdoor teaching of creationism. Because if you question Darwinism, students will think, well, gee, maybe creation's true. So it's indirectly teaching creationism. Adolf Hitler said, let me control the textbooks and I will control the state. And that is very much a concern in the United States, and that's one reason why homeschooling has grown, because a lot of parents do not want the state to control their kids. They don't agree with what the state is indoctrinating their kids into, and so they elect to homeschool. And the goal is indoctrinate you first, and then the nations they conquer. And one thing you'll notice is when Hitler conquered nations, even Poland to some degree, the crowds were unanimous, almost, at least the Germans claim such, in support of Nazism, even to some degree in Poland, which surprised me. Eugenics, like a tree, draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity, it says. This is a famous illustration. How do they determine who the superior race is? Well, a lot of measurements. These were developed by the Nazi eugenicists, the scientists, and here you can see they're measuring this guy to see whether or not he qualifies as an Aryan. A lot of people they couldn't tell for sure, so they have very complex ways of determining that. Eye charts, they use that eye chart and determine if you were Aryan enough. If your eyes were too dark, you had a problem. I don't know if Hitler was ever tested, but they should have tested him. They might have been surprised. But he had to have blue eyes, ideally. The bluer, the better, and there you can see some boys were being tested with the eye chart. That's a simpler one. And Corporal Goldberg was the ideal German soldier, touted throughout Germany as the perfect Aryan brave soldier, and then they embarrassingly found out that he was a Jew. Oops. A little mistake there. And why do they have to wear the Star of David? There's, you can see some typical Aryan. So there's no question they're Aryan. We're okay here. But why did they wear the Star of David? Because you can't always tell that they're part of inferior race, so you have to wear a symbol to indicate that, which is amazing. Anti-Jewish ideas. Hitler was confident that the world would someday thank him for eliminating this rotten parasitic race, even if Germany lost the war. Toward the end of the war, when they knew they were losing, basically Hitler said, well, we're losing the war, and the German people are obviously the inferior race because we're losing the war, so we deserve to die. We deserve to be wiped out because, well, science has proved, at least the war has proved, we are the inferior race. And so he ordered his underlings to begin bombing not the American troops, but begin bombing the German cities. Now, the person didn't carry this out, but that was the order. He talks about that, I think, in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He covers that. And there's two German Jews. And, of course, they obviously look like Jews to you and me, don't they? On the street, I couldn't tell that they were Jewish, especially the young lady. So they had to wear a sign to indicate who they were. Hitler and his top Nazi leaders were a product of German education, science, and the prevailing social worldview in the late 19th and early 20th century. Their participation in what was the most infamous episodes of human history, human suffering, and death in the history of the humans could possibly have predicted. And you couldn't have predicted what they did. The core of Nazism. Jews were morally inferior. Christianity was, and in Hitler's words, a bastard of Judaism, and must eventually be destroyed. Thus the Holocaust. 6 million Jews and about 5 million Polish Christians were murdered. And then if you add the Christians in Ukraine, etc., you find more Christians were murdered than Jews. Why oppose Christianity? Well, the opposite beliefs. Christianity stresses helping the weak, helping the handicapped, etc., whereas the Nazism stresses the opposite. And Slavics especially. Slavics were a special target of the Nazis. Jews at first because there were a fair number of Jews in Germany. About 0.7% of the Jews, of the German population, were Jews. The Aryan race was primarily German and Scandinavian. And there you can see a leading Darwinist in Germany, Ernst Haeckel. And you can see what he taught. This is the lowest race down here. Well, this is an ape, which they consider the lowest race. And then these are humans, and these are apes. And you'll notice there's not much difference between the highest ape and the lowest human. And this is found in the German textbooks. And here is another way of showing that. They did the angle of the forehead. And you can see you start out with fish and work your way forward. And here we're already in humans. So the inferior humans, less inferior and superior. And so that was one way they measured superior races. Josef Mengele, probably one of the most famous Nazis, Nazi doctors. And he had an MD in medicine and a PhD in evolutionary biology. And his goal was very enthusiastically to try to figure out what we can do to classify according to race and help the superior races to become even more superior, or at least understand why they were superior. A lot of his experiments he did today we see as foolish. For example, he injected blue dye in the eyes, hopefully to get blue eyes, which of course is ludicrous. All it did was cause a problem, but in fact, a lot of the science that he did today we recognize as pretty incredibly stupid. There, Dr. Josef Mengele, he was wanted, reward $2.3 million. Boy, he was wanted for lots of money. He used twins to study the influence of race versus the environment, and these are some examples. What happened was some would claim were twins who weren't. So you knew if you claimed to be a twin, mothers learned this, gossip in the camp, and so they would say, my children are twins. And then they would become part of the twins' experiments, and they weren't exterminated. Normally, children were exterminated right away. And they injected people with a variety of chemicals. They wanted to see, for example, which race lived the longest. So they injected certain chemicals with, gasoline was one thing they injected them with, and they wanted to determine whether or not some races would live longer than others. And they found, by the way, injecting their veins with gasoline was a very effective way of killing people. These were written up in medical journals, and a lot of his experiments were relied upon for years as evidence of various things. In fact, that was a controversy fairly recently because a lot of the diagrams of the human body were obtained by doctors in the concentration camp by dissecting living people. They're going to die anyway, so why not learn some anatomy by dissecting living people? Because when they're dead, the body changes. And so they wanted to understand the body physiology and anatomy when they were alive. And they had to tie them down. In fact, the screaming was so great that they had to do this after a while away from the camp because it bothered everybody else. Other people had a hard time working with all this screaming going on. Vacuum the lungs till it ruptured. They would do research on freezing, determine how long they could live. Now, some of these had a practical reason. For example, if a plane was shot down in the frigid waters near Scandinavia, and it's been 28 minutes ago, should you bother to go there and try to rescue them? So they determined how long it would take for the pilot to die in the cold water, and if they were going to be in there that long, they didn't bother to go there to rescue them. They could save a trip. And so there were practical reasons that they did some of this research. Inflated with subject with a variety of chemicals, and starved them to death to see which race lived the longest under conditions of starvation. And my guess is probably they didn't really find much difference. One horrible experiment was they put phosphorus on the Jews and set them on fire to research treating burns. Now, I would think they would have plenty of cases among the German soldiers who were burned. I didn't think they had to produce the burns to do research. There's plenty out there to do research on. And again, the screaming, they had to move them from away from the camp. And this is some pictures of brutal research. And high altitude decompression. They wanted to know how high the planes could fly before they would pass out. So that's why this research was done. Millions of bodies had to be disposed of. And the Nazi goal is to replace the Bible with Mein Kampf. And Hermann Goering, the second most powerful Nazi, and he hated the church as well. And Darwinism is the engine that drives atheism. I have a book coming out which is titled basically Darwinism is the Doorway to Atheism. And a lot of people wonder, what's the concern about Darwinism? When we talk about going into churches, they say, I don't want you to talk about this because it's controversial. First of all, it's not. Secondly, they say, we stress preaching Christ. We don't need to bring in controversy. After all, God could have used evolution to create humans, so no problem. Well, if you're fairly intelligent, when you study Darwinism, you realize you put God out of a job. There's nothing left for him to do, because Darwinism pretty much explains, or tries to explain, everything. Where'd the moon come from? Evolution. I just taught astronomy a couple of semesters ago, and they explained everything via evolution. Where do the stars come from, the galaxies come from, the nebulae, the supernova? They explained it all by evolution. So it's not just biology, but it's everything that they try to explain. The top scientists, about 98%, the studies vary, but about 98% are atheists. And as I said, the case against Darwinism is overwhelming. Why is evolution believed? Well, most of us conform. Most Germans conformed. In Germany, that's why they didn't have much resistance against going to war. And we conform. It's everywhere. Textbooks, on TV. I read about a book a week. And even books that have nothing to do with evolution invariably mention evolution. Science books especially, they're filled full of evolutionary ideas. Same thing with TV. Same thing with so many other areas where evolution is just assumed. And as a result, it becomes part of our culture. And we assume these ideas because we hear them over and over again, and thus we accept it. The two books theory, one book is God wrote the Bible, and the second book is God created the life and the universe. And we can learn about God from the Bible as well as his creation. And if you study his creation, you realize it doesn't conflict with the Bible. And sometimes it seems to, but it doesn't. And today we realize that the cell, the human cell, all cells, even a bacteria cell, is the most complex machine in the universe. This gives you an idea of some of the destruction They were told when the Americans and British bombed Cologne, or Kurland as they say, they were told, don't bomb the cathedral. And so after the war was over, you can see there's not much left of the city, but the cathedral is standing proud because they were not supposed to bomb the cathedrals. And the reason, one reason that Europe now is falling away from Christianity, it's primarily a pagan state, as they say, is because it's hard to accept Christianity when you had Christians killing Christians. And that's what you had, Christians killing Christians. And after the war, European religiosity plummeted. But of course, the solution, the answer to that is what? If they were devout Christians, understood the Bible, Hitler would not have been able to recruit the armies as effectively as he did. In fact, the major source of COs in this country as well as other countries was Christianity. The Mennonites, a large number were COs. Now, a problem we have in this country is we were not the aggressors. We were defending our allies. So our war was not a war of invading other countries. It was to stop the invaders. So we had a more valid reason to object to the war. This is Cologne, Kurland, and you can see there's not much left. Almost all the major cities in Germany were destroyed. This, you can see, is Dresden. And the British bombed that, and this is Dresden again, and Hamburg. All you have left is the shells of the apartment buildings. And another picture. The color pictures are better because it looks more like what we're used to a city being. It looks like real buildings and real people. And what Hitler attempted to do, of course, clearly is one of the most heinous crimes of history. And Darwin is the father of one of the most destructive philosophies in history. And I spend a lot of time in my book demonstrating how Darwin was central in the whole idea of Nazism, especially, of course, the idea relative to racism, which is pretty obvious. About 55 million persons died. Himmler had no qualms about killing millions of people, especially those he deemed inferior races, to achieve his Darwinian eugenic goal of producing a superior race. And this is a quote from a leading authority on Himmler. And in USA, we didn't kill him typically, we sterilized him. And this is a plaque, which I think is in Indiana, where they sterilized, forced sterilization, about 7,600 people from 33 to 73. It was only stopped about 1973 in Indiana. And that surprises people because we think California had a monopoly on such things, but Indiana had their share. And this is a letter one of our eugenicists wrote to Adolf Hitler and said, hey, we're working on it, and we admire you, you're doing a good job, but we're behind. Darwin's attitude toward women, he listed what he concluded were the advantages of marriage, and I covered this before, but he basically concluded a woman is better than a dog anyhow, someone to take care of the house. And most women would not be very flattered with that comparison. That's pretty bad. And Darwin wrote he would, as a married man, he'd be worse than a Negro, but reminisced, you can't live your life with groggy old age and friendless and cold and childless staring one in one's face, so he concluded he'll get married, and there was his wife. And this is from his book, The Descent of Man. And he basically said man can obtain a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can women. So whatever men try, they can obtain a higher eminence than can women. And the average mental power of man must be above that of women, is what Darwin said. And the reason he believed that was because natural selection weeds off the weak men, but we protect women. And therefore they're protected, and therefore the weaker women are not weeded off, they're not killed, where the weaker men are killed in war. So that was his reasoning. And the racism was a very important part of his program. And you can see a picture of a Hottentot and a gorilla, and those are both very distorted, as is obvious. We do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile. Our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the lives of everyone to the last moment. Vaccinations preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. So he's basically saying, we need to produce a superior race, let the weak die. But he realized later on that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, this section here inspired a lot of people, like the Nazis. In fact, they relied heavily upon Darwin's words to develop their ideas. Heavily. World wars, World War I was 7 times greater than all wars in history put together, and World War II was 4 times greater than World War I. And World War I, thus, was 28 times greater than all wars put together in history. And this is in 100 years, we equaled 28 times all wars put together in history. And it's clear if you study this, if Hitler was not influenced by Darwinism and was a Christian and accepted the idea that all men and women are descendants of the first couple, there wouldn't have been a World War II. If there was, we probably would not have had anything like has happened after and during World War II. There wouldn't have been a Holocaust. He would have drafted the Jews, and they would have been in the army fighting for their country as they did in World War I. In fact, they fought bravely, the Jews, in World War I. So many of the generals were Jewish in World War I that Hitler said, I will determine who's a Jew. And so many who served faithfully in World War I, who were generals, were not in part of the Holocaust, were exempt. In fact, there's a whole book called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, where he kind of made exceptions for. So it's hard to speculate in history, but some people feel if you remove the racism and yet keep the war, they would have probably won World War II. Okay, it's speculation, but interesting. And the next thing I'll look at is atheistic communism. There is Karl Marx as a young man. Evolution was a central plank in Marx's doctrine. Marx was a committed Christian until he encountered the materialistic atheistic ideas as a student at the University of Berlin. He became not only an atheist, but strongly anti-Christian, and he developed the idea that the church religion is the opiate of the people, and you need to overthrow your masters. And the church said, well, you'll get your reward in heaven. So that's why he felt it was the opiate of the people. And there you can see he's honored in Cuba for obvious reasons, 1983. His worldwide influence, historian Isaiah, who is a historian of Karl Marx, he said in the 19th century has had so direct, deliberate, and powerful influence on mankind as Karl Marx. No one has had such an influence as Karl Marx. And The Origin impressed Marx perhaps deeply as any book he ever read. So Marx was very supportive of Darwinism, and that was a very important idea in his repertoire. And he became a Darwinist, detested belief in the supernatural, denounced all religion as the opiate of the people, as I mentioned. And in nearly every nation where the communists took over, the churches were either abolished or neutralized. And we see that still today to some degree in China. We certainly see it in other countries like Cambodia, China earlier, the Soviet Union, etc. And before becoming converts to Darwinism, Marx, Stalin, and Hitler, and Mao all accepted the Christian teaching that all humans were brothers. And that's according to the historian who is one of the leading historians on this period. If Marx and Engels had continued to embrace Christian creationism, they would not have become leaders of the anti-Christian totalitarian movements that opposed Christianity. And the second major killer, well, actually the first, was communism. Engels, the same thing. Marx himself wasn't too successful. Engels owned a factory, and so Engels was important in what Marx did. And Engels was also raised by a strict Bible-believing father, and he seriously began to question his faith when he began reading liberal German theologians. And a major factor that influenced these liberal theologians was Darwin's writings. So sometimes it was through theologians that they accepted these ideas. And the result, about 77 million people died since Christ. The estimates are 45.5 million in the last century alone. So we're talking about over half of people who were murdered by wars and so on occurred after World War, or during World War I and after. Communism, Nazism dead, the estimate is about 167 million. And many more died of disease, especially in Ukraine, famine, and from injury. So we're talking about, indeed, Darwinism is the faith of death. And there are, people debate these statistics, but some people say it's a lot more than 167 million. Some estimates are over 80 million in Russia alone, but I'm trying to be conservative here. But the death toll is enormous. Lenin, he was influenced by Darwinism. He was raised by devout Bible-believing parents. He himself was. In 1892, he discovered Darwin and Marx, and that changed his life and the world. Still affects the world today. Lenin soon developed a fascination with the ideas of Charles Darwin, to the degree that Marxism and Darwinism soon became his new religion, according to this author, Professor Service. And same thing with Joseph Stalin. In fact, he was in seminary when he discovered Darwin. He killed an estimated 60 million humans, and this is according to a Soviet expert who estimated close to 60 million were killed by Stalin. Probably one of the most ruthless dictators, among the most. And from accounts of his seminary experience, he was studying to be a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church, and he read Darwin, became an atheist. A boyhood friend of Stalin says, there's no God. And then the friend said, how do you say such things? So-so, they called Stalin so-so. How can you say that? And so-so, Stalin said, I'll lend you a book. We'll show you that. All this talk about God is nonsense. And this book, of course, was Darwin. So he left the seminary, and the rest is history. There, as a young man, became an avid Darwinian, abandoned his faith in God, although his parents really had a hard time accepting what he did. They never did accept it. But he believed that we descended from apes, not from Adam. And therefore, communist civil war fatalities, about 16 million. Fatalities from agriculture collectivization, 22 million. Purges, 19 million. Killed during the war, 15 million. Executions and repressions after the war, 9 million. A total of 81 million. And this is again by a leading historian. And Harvard study evaluated 902 major wars that occurred between 500 BC and AD 1918. World War I casualties were 7 times greater than all the 901 previous wars combined. And total cost of World War I, 4 times greater than, World War II, 4 times greater than World War I. And about $4 trillion, $1945. And source of the idea, Darwin, as I said at the beginning of the talk, he wanted to murder God. So to murder God, you have to destroy the reason people believe in him. And why do they believe in him? The creation. The creation requires a creator, and Darwin's creator was natural selection. And Richard Dawkins, who is very popular among creationists, we like to read him, I guess because he's so easy to prove wrong. And he says that evolution allows one to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, which creationists say, yeah, that's about right. And as I mentioned, atheists push evolution. And here's that statistic again. Yet, as I mentioned, hopefully twice, third time now, the case against Darwinism is overwhelming. You have to read and study to know that. And it's hard, I guess, to sit down and read books about this. But, come to presentations like this. And here we covered this before. Ota Benga. In fact, there's a movie about this now, and there's a new book about Ota Benga. He was a pygmy put in a zoo, and this in this country, in New York, was seen as proof of evolution. There we go. Proof of evolution. Look at this pygmy. He was about, 4'6" or something, 4'7". And that was an attempt to indoctrinate the people in Darwinism. Julia Pastrana, another case. And she was demonstrated throughout, displayed, and acted and sang throughout the United States and Europe. And she was the ape woman proof of evolution. You doubt evolution, there you go. There is Julia. And she, though, turned out to be a very intelligent young woman. She was fluent in 4 languages that we knew. Spanish, she was from South America, from Mexico, sorry. And she knew English and Russian, and loved to read. And here you can see in America, the KKK. It may surprise you to know that the KKK relied heavily upon, guess who? Charles Darwin, for their ideas. And Margaret Sanger, they also utilized. She basically said that the black communities must distinguish leaders, must be helped to carry out the plan, which was designed to their own detriment. She wanted to eliminate the Negroes. She called this the Negro Project. And to do that, she needed the cooperation of the ministers. And she got that and began the abortion movement, which, birth control as well, which helped reduce the black population. Still today, in America, the highly disproportionate number of abortions are among African Americans. And here's a few more statements she made, which are not very nice. We don't want the word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And I guess I could read these other ones, but she said that she wanted to eliminate the inferior races, which were Orientals, Jews, and blacks. And she referred to them as human weeds. And here later on she said the most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. And this is David Duke. He wrote a book called My Awakening, which is thoroughly documented and thoroughly evolutionist. He clearly, bright fellow, honor student, went to Texas State University, clearly based his ideas of racial inferiority on Darwinism. And he was the head of the KKK. He actually ran for the Louisiana State Legislature and was elected once. So actually he did a really good summary of the literature relative to Darwinism and eugenics and how evolution supported eugenics. And that's it. Try to summarize what I said, and I went through this probably too fast, but there's overwhelming evidence that Darwinism had a horrible influence on society. I hate to say billions, but hundreds of millions of people suffered as a result of these ideas. And it's hard to rewrite history, but it's pretty clear when you read the literature, and there's no shortage of literature. I have probably 1,000 books that document this, and my books simply summarize, so you don't have to read 1,000 books. You can just read my 6, and you'll get pretty much all the basic ideas found in these 1,000 books. So it's overwhelming evidence that Darwinism had an adverse effect on human people, race. And they say, the evolutionists say, well, it was perverted. Really wasn't perverted at all. I mean, a straight line reading of Darwinism, it's pretty clear what's obvious. Indeed, there are superior races, and we need to eliminate the inferior races. So he made that very clear in his writings, although he himself didn't advocate going out and doing that, but people read his works and say, well, we'll do it. In fact, the Council of Wannsee, where they determined the final solution, that's a film of that based on the transcript at that event in Berlin, a suburb of Berlin, called Confessions. I think it's called Confessions, but see me after and I can give you the title. But basically, toward the end, the head of that said, Darwin would be proud of what we decided today, namely to exterminate the Jews via the gas chambers. And that's when they made the decision to utilize gas chambers. Bullets were messy and slow, and you had to shoot people, and you didn't always kill them, so you had to use 2 or 3 bullets, and you got blood on your uniform, and it was gory, and you had, it was hard. So the gas chambers took all the gore away. You just herd them into gas chambers, lock the door, turn on the gas, and then you bring the Jews in to take the bodies out. So the Jews did pretty much all the work in disposing of the bodies. And they worked hard to hopefully work their way out of the camps, but that typically didn't work. And so they were the ones to drag the bodies to the furnace. And they burned the bodies and had to strip them of hair first and teeth and whatever they could to use for the German war machine, and that's what they did. And the Jews did that mostly. By the way, the best place to work in the camps was, anybody know? The best place to work in the camps was Canada. If you behaved yourself, and the Gestapo said, you're going to Canada. Oh, thank God, thank God. And what they did in Canada was they sorted the luggage, things like that. So it was a good job. And they often, it wasn't hard. They could take breaks. And by far the best place in the camp was Canada. Why'd they call it Canada? Because they saw in Germany, they saw Canada as the best place in the world. It's paradise. Well, I don't know. You tell me why. I think they did because America, we had problems with racism and all this and just perpetual problems, civil wars. And has Canada ever had had a war with us once, I think. But Canada was it's just a peaceful place. It's beautiful scenery and nice people, and they just heard nothing negative about Canada. And therefore, better places in the camp, the best place was called Canada. And that's where they behaved themselves. They were sent to Canada, and if you read a lot about this period, you find that you have to know these expressions, because that means, oh, thank God I'm going to Canada. I'm saved. I can maybe get out of here. Maybe the war will end. Maybe America will win the war, and I can get out and go to Canada. Really go to Canada, which a lot of people did, by the way. A lot of people after the war came to Canada. So that might have had something to do with it. A lot of the Jews in Nazi Germany, to get out, a lot of them went to Canada. And so we had a quota for Jews, and Canada, I don't think, did.
Why don't we thank Dr.